Hello, my name is Daniel Coleman, and I'm really pleased to be talking today with Rick Hill about the work we've done together on the two-row wampum covenant chain as a guide for university research partnerships.
Well, Chuan, my name is Rick Hill. I'm a Tuscarora from Six Nations. Daniel and I have been working on developing this research protocol when we first met at Six Nations Polytechnic.
Yeah, so one of the ways to say of how we got started in this work is to remember that a little over a decade ago, there was a group of people who met to think about developing an Indigenous Knowledge Center at Six Nations Polytechnic, and we consulted with the elders of the time who were knowledge guardians there. And I particularly remember Lottie Key and Ima Johnson and Hubert Skye, who were in the room, and they were saying, if you're going to start this Indigenous-led research center on the reserve, it'd be good to think of calling it Deo Hahage, meaning in Cayuga language, the two roads or the two paths. And of course, they were alluding to the two-row wampum and the covenant chain relationships that were way back in treaty history between Haudenosaunee people and incoming Europeans. And they were saying, to develop this knowledge center, you'll need to work with the best of Western and Haudenosaunee knowledge.
So typically, you think of Western knowledge, Indigenous knowledge coming together and overlapping, and there's a critical space in between. But this graphic talks about it a little differently, that each one has its own kind of code of ethics. And so that's what we're doing, is we're engaging these different things together so that we create a new ethical space between them. In many ways, you could say ethical space was created over 400 years ago in this treaty relationship between the Haudenosaunee and the Dutch. It's represented by this wampum belt called the two-row wampum. And the message of the belt is what inspired us to take a look at the space it means. So you can see, this is a replica of the belt. It's quite long, but aptly named. There's two purple rows or paths going down the whole length of the belt. And so we kind of examined that. What does that mean to be in relationship with one another?
Yeah, and so part of that thing of ethical space is that it was distinctive when the original two-row wampum agreement was being made between the early Dutch arrivees on the Hudson River, Mohawk River area with the Haudenosaunee people, that they said, well, we noticed that you travel in a ship and we travel in a canoe on the River of Life, and you have your culture and beliefs and laws and you carry them in your vessel, and we have our culture and beliefs and laws and we carry them in our vessel. In other words, there was a clear sense that there were different ways of knowing and living carried in those vessels, and that the purpose of forming an ethical relationship, a healthy relationship on the River of Life, was to bring these into dialogue with one another, not to keep them completely unconnected, but also to recognize that they were distinct from one another, so that that space in between wasn't just blank space, it was ethical space, filled with peace, friendship, and respect, the three principles that are central and carried in those white rows, you could say, of the two-row wampum.
So we began to think about the ship carrying then that Western ways of knowing, running in parallel to Indigenous ways of knowing. We're just trying to get back to that now, but in the old, that was the idea back then, that there are equal partners traveling down this river of life together. And in looking at that, we realized that the white spaces beyond the two purple rows could represent that. The laws, the traditions, the beliefs that were put into the ship or into the canoe, we still retain its internal integrity, but this dialogue between those is what's been created.
So this term, ethical space of engagement, has been discussed by a Cree philosopher and thinker named Willie Ermine. And he talks about the deliberate attention to what he calls the two solitudes and the space between those two solitudes. And he didn't mean that those two rows forever remain all alone and so on, but he wanted to attend to the distinctiveness of each of those traditions of knowing. You know, a lot of times when people are thinking about dialogue with one another, they want to reach for common ground. What do we have together? And there's a way in which sometimes you can kind of not be as aware of the different forms of knowing that are meeting at that time. And it's really important to have ethical relationships for one row, not to kind of assume that it already knows the way of thinking of the other, or to incorporate others' ways of thinking into one's own ways of thinking without realizing how distinctive they are. And that's really important. The early Haudenosaunee, when they were meeting the Dutch, didn't say, well, you have to forget Dutch and learn only Mohawk language and come to residential school, that kind of thing. They were saying, no, what you bring with you has value. It's distinctive, it's unique. And that creates this ethical space for peace, friendship, and respect between the two rows.
So if we look at this as a model then of how you can conduct research or collaboration, we'll say between the academy and an Indigenous community, those three principles link those two different ways of knowing. And it's also not saying one is above the other, even though it's depicted here, that they're a different way. When you add them together, you understand things. So it's really about building in this partnership that's based upon a different kind of friendship. And we maybe don't always think about that with research, but that's what you're doing. You're building community, a collaborative community. And then we use this good-mindedness, means we're going to be fair to one another, we're going to listen well to one another, we're not going to just dismiss what you say right from the get-go. And if we do that, it'll restore some balance that was intended by the original two-row. And then when you have this balance and this friendship and this trust, see, then you get this ongoing peace, because ultimately, maintaining peace within the world was the objective of our culture, our treaty making, and I think that's what this is about too, is restoring that peace between our communities.
So this is an image of a related wampum agreement known as the covenant chain, the friendship belt, that depicts, you could say, the two human figures of the two rows at opposite ends and how they linked arms together. Or, you know, when the people arrived across the ocean, they said, well, you live far away, so we can represent that linked arms by means of the rope that holds the two together. And that's kind of a reminder that there's very distinct traditions of knowing, but they're bound together. There's a common concern and alliance that's being formed between them.
So you could say this covenant chain came with our first treaty with the English after they defeated the Dutch in about 1667. So now the thing that links them, that becomes the new ethical space. There's still these two bodies of people, two bodies of thought, two different governments, two different cultures, but they're linked together intentionally in order to resolve the differences between them. And they call that a linking of the arms. So just that act, in fact, that's kind of what Daniel and I have done over the years, is that we've joined together in friendship to address a variety of matters in the academy. But it means bringing our mind together, so we both learn off of each other at how to approach this, and that's what our protocol represents. It's the best of our individual thinking, reflecting the deep inheritance that we receive.
So we've been talking about the links between the three links of peace, respect, and friendship, or respect, trust, and ongoing friendship. And you think about some of these terms, they're really quite remarkable terms. Like, think about the word respect. Respect. You know, spect is the root for spectator, spectacles, to look at things. But respect means to look again. Or you could even say to look back, or to be seen, to be aware of being seen. You know, one of the things about respect is that it's not only that you have a view of things and you look at something, maybe you contemplate things carefully, but you're also aware of being seen by what you look at. You know, there's research paradigms that often think of the researcher and the subject of research as if that subject is an inanimate thing. But we know so often that research relationships are between live beings, live communities, and therefore there needs to be that kind of reciprocity of respect. Respect, seeing back, seeing again, being seen by what you look at. And that requires trust. If you don't trust the gaze that's going to be observing or examining or studying, then you don't want to reveal too much. You know, so that reliable feeling of trust is so important to these three principles.
And if you think about it, given our history, that's one of the most challenging things, learning to trust each other, trust the people from the academy are well-intended and bringing a good a heart to the matter. And then also trusting in ourselves, because, when you get colonized, sometimes you internalize that oppression. So it's a delicate dance, that's for sure. But if we do it well, if we get committed to it, and kind of forgive ourselves along the way, that we'll keep trying, we'll keep pursuing this state of peace, you're going to develop that ongoing friendship where we really care about one another. And I think this is what Indigenous knowledge is bringing to this process of research. It's not abstract to be just sit on the shelf, but it's got to have some tangible benefit to both sides that help promote, you could say, the underlying value of peace.
And these values come from the ways in which Haudenosaunee people traditionally lived in longhouses. The sense of, if you were going to respect and see one another again, you did every day across the fire, right in the longhouse, where everyday resources of living in the world and food and hunting and all the things that you needed to share in order to have a future way of life. These principles rose right out of everyday life. They weren't elaborated in the kind of abstract world of academic research, if you want to put it that way. They came out from the everyday need to help one another that was part of family life, extended family life in the longhouse arrangements.
I've thought a lot about that, or trying to reimagine what it would be like to live in that old bark longhouse where you have a couple hundred people living there. So now we live in there, our single family homes. And it requires a different mindset, a different relationship. But the other thing that the old people taught me is not everybody can do it all. So you depend on everybody for the different skills that they bring. So in this drawing here, we see a layout of a longhouse. And in those family cubicles, we just put in these ideas that somebody's got to make pottery, somebody's got to make clothes, somebody's got to know how to fish, somebody's got to know how to make a fire. And so it's collectively, see, all that knowledge is gathered together. And I think that's important to understand, too, that you're not just talking to a native advisor or a consultant that's learning to understand that there's a whole lot of people in the community that carry that responsibility for the very thing that you're talking about.
The other thing about that, too, is you can see the literal two rows of how people lived, passing back and forth the needs of life across the fire. And, that whole, you could say the architecture of the longhouse became part of early wampum iconography. So this wampum is often known as the first sighting of the pale faces from when Jacques Cartier arrived on the St. Lawrence River. And we know the story of how the sailors were sick with scurvy from not having healthy food as they traveled across the ocean. And Haudenosaunee people brought their knowledge of medicine plants to bring them back to health. And you can see these rafters, you could see those angled beads on this wampum as rafters, and the strong, thick rafters protecting and holding up the weak one in the middle, supporting them. You could see almost the two sides of the longhouse providing shelter and safety for that weak rafter, the sick one in the middle. And this is how the idea of these rows, you can see once again the rows being formed of peace, friendship, and respect to uphold the ones who need, everyday provision and health.
So we think of knowledge as like a house. It's just full of these ideas, all of these skills and experience and learning. But there's also an intention that it's going to continue. So by adding value of different points of view and really thoughtfully working together to collaborate on that, you're going to strengthen that house of knowledge. It won't just be like a castle telling you what to think, but it's a place where you gather together to exchange ideas.
So that brings us to, as Rick and I were working on developing this article on thinking through the principles of the two-row to guide healthy research relationships between Indigenous communities and academic ones or scholarly ones, we came up with these 5 principles. There are many more. We had a list of 10 or more principles that we kind of sorted through, and we kind of boiled them down to these. And of course, as you're thinking through these forms of agreement making, you may come up with others as well. But the first principle that we came up with was just observing the dialogical nature of research relationships. I was saying a little bit earlier that there's a tradition of thinking of the researcher and the research subject, and that can kind of deaden the activity of the people who feel they're being, quotes, researched, or that their knowledge is being abstracted or extracted. And we wanted to emphasize that with thinking through the two-row, good thinking, good minds develop out of dialogue, out of two sides sharing the conversation with each other.
You think of most research starts with a literature review. What did everybody else have to say about the topic that you're looking at? You could say it's kind of a dialogue between you and them, but it's a one-sided dialogue. And what we're proposing here is that in order to really build this relationship, you have to have a sincere dialogue in which you're not only talking to one another, but active listening, and then you're doing some deep reflection about what it is you're hearing. So it's just part of it is making sure we're communicating properly, making sure that we understand each other, so that when an issue comes up, because words can be a little funny. Somebody might say something, you think it means this, so you have to kind of reaffirm with them. This is what I heard you say. What did you mean by that? And that's the kind of dialogue that we're talking about. And so when a matter comes up, some new data comes up, we can examine it a little bit more deeply about what's the deeper meaning to that. And by having this dialogue, it also means that we're helping each other grow our consciousness about the ship and the canoe. And then we strengthen that, just like in the house, we all become stronger because of the words that we share.
Which brings us to a second principle. And this one's an interesting one to think about because in a way it's quite unfamiliar, you might think, to the Western Academy. And that's the principle of the importance of place-conscious ceremony. If you think of the word the university, there's a kind of assumption within that the university is a place that's looking for kind of universal knowledge, the same single knowledge that's everywhere in the world. It kind of like dislocates the place-specific, the location of where knowledge comes from, and thinks of it in terms of global. We have these languages of knowledge mobilization and things like that want to take knowledge and spread it around the world, but kind of lose track of the exact place and the location and the context from which that knowledge emerged. And it's important to be location conscious, the land and the place where these ideas, these language concepts, these ways of understanding things emerged for the first point. And then the ceremonial nature of it, it's very easy to just be on autopilot, going along with the ways you already know things, the set of assumptions you already have about what the world looks like. And you could say that one of the functions of a ceremonial moment is that it pauses autopilot. It pauses us on the onrush of our assumptions and says, this is a special moment. Stop and pay attention to this particular place and time and the people who are gathered here, to the beings beyond the human that are gathered here, so that you're kind of in a heightened state of consciousness as you approach research topics, so that you're not just operating on everyday assumptions that are already in your mind and in your place.
Sometimes scholars get a little leery of ceremony, spirituality, belief. But what we're saying is that's at the core of our being, and sometimes it's ceremony with a little c. So whenever we gather in Haudenosaunee communities, we always start with these words of gratitude, this Thanksgiving address, by which we acknowledge all of the things in the universe that keep us alive. But it also gives us a chance to reflect on our relationship to those things. So we were meeting with graduate students, both from McMaster and Polytechnic, and we're discussing these matters, and we decided we're going to start our meetings the way they start all the meetings in the community. And it changes the way you think about why you're here, what's your relationship to the people that you're in conversation with. That's the kind of thing we're talking about. Whatever the protocol is that people have, there's a reason why that protocol exists. It is that kind of a cultural handshake. It's the bringing people together. But the other thing that I think it's important to remember here, that most Native people believe their knowledge comes from the earth, comes from that place where the bones of their ancestors are where the children had been birthed, where they made their family fires, their council fires. So I've been all across North America, and I tell you, I've been to the center of the universe so many times. You know, I go to the Haidas, the Hopis, the Lakotas, they all say, and everything began right here. And so I don't kind of argue with them, well, that can't be true, you know, there's only got to be one creation. And I said, because we're so tied to that place. And when you're tied to that place, the mountains become significant, the waters, the hills, the trees, the fish, the animals, the birds. And so that's what we're talking about here, is that place in which you are building this relationship becomes important to relate to the knowledge of that place. If we try to transport our knowledge, Haudenosaunee knowledge, say to Haida country, we're going to find we need to create that ethical space between us because there's some similarities, as you mentioned, but also their place is so distinctive to them. So it's about respecting that fact. What do you know from where you come from? I remember one time there was two scholars, an indigenous and non-indigenous, arguing. The indigenous scholar was confronting the white scholar and said, you know, you got to get back in the community where the culture is. And then he stood there and he says, well, my dear, the library is my culture. And it's true. So we have different sources of which the knowledge comes. And to me, it's always been a very vigorous, enlightening dialogue when we compare the two.
So that brings us to our third principle, which is thinking about equity within distinctiveness. You know, when you look at the two-row wampum, you see that these rows are identical. You know, there's no distinguishing feature to say this is the ship side and this is the canoe side. They look exactly equitable, you could say that. And yet the whole point of having these two rows is to remind us of the distinctiveness of the ways in which people travel on the river of life. And, you know, a lot of times when you're looking for dialogue or common ground, it's easy to kind of wipe out the distinctiveness of each other in the effort to find the common ground. And what gets lost that way is what's unique and powerful about the way people think. Rick was just talking about the importance of the library, for example, in Western culture. Well, you know, book learning has a really good place in it. And there's a rich tradition of learning from books that is valid and important. Just as there is with knowing the stories that have been told by multiple generations and having oral systems of knowledge transmission. These are distinctive, and there's many other kinds of distinctiveness that need to be respected. So we're talking about equity within distinctiveness as an important principle for building good relations between scholarly and Indigenous communities.
Yeah, I've had to learn that too, because when you think about it, I started working at a museum when I was quite young, but there is a museum culture. There's an art museum culture, you know, there's the academy culture. So you can't just say the monolithic ship as if it's one thing. There's a lot of diversity within that ship, and the same with us. And even within our own community, like at Six Nations, there can be a variety of opinions on a particular matter. And it's quite challenging. But if you're going to spend all that time doing a literature search and look at all of the things written before, you also have to consider all of the things that are said in the community and taking a look at those different points of view on that matter, but kind of dig a little deeper to say, what are people really saying? And sometimes those little distinctive differences don't affect the core messaging. So coming up with that idea that there's still this equity, I mean, there's still this equality, there still can be this balance between the internal distinctiveness of both sides, but that's the nature of a relationship, of working your way through it. And so that we find out that it's not just about our shared interests, although those would be core, but we're learning more about even how we understand that by considering and working with other points of view.
Which brings us to the fourth principle of the presence of internal pluralism and diversity within. Rick was just saying, well, there's many views within Haudenosaunee ways of thinking, just as there are in, let's say, that broad category of Western thought. And you know, it's always really struck me that when the original wampum makers were making the two-row, they didn't make these purple rows out of single rows of beads. They made 2 rows of 2. So in other words, the image of the path of the vessel has a couple of rows wide. They assumed plurality or pluralism within each of the rows right from the beginning. And of course they did. You know, you think Six Nations was a confederacy of nations, not just a single homogeneous group. And they met the Dutch, and then they met the British, and they met the French. So the incoming people were also quite pluralistic and diverse, and they had to build relationships between the rows, which understood themselves as being not just homogeneous, but diverse within themselves. And of course, that kind of diversity has only multiplied in the years since, 400 years since these agreements were first made.
You know, that's a good point too, because we've been trying to develop, rekindle a relationship between us and Anishinaabeg people. And you can fall very quickly into an argument about whose land is it. But if we look deeper through our tradition, like this idea of this a dish with one spoon, like right where we are now, this place. So there used to be natives here a long time ago, and other people moved in. The Haudenosaunee actually used to come and hunt here as well. We created communities here in the 1600s. And we had a conflict with the Anishinaabeg people, and then they move in. The same land, though, is inspiring both of our cultures. So by talking to the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabeg people about this place, you gain a wider perspective. And the fact is that love and dependency that we have from a place gets nurtured by where you are. When I go, to a distant community, sometimes it feels different because you're speaking a different language, do different traditions, but there's also something that makes it feel like this is still part of my home. And I think that's what we're talking about here. So yeah, it's just like among scientists, is Pluto a planet or not? We got people arguing about this on both sides. So science itself is always kind of, I don't want to say evolving, but it's constantly moving, rethinking itself, coming up with new information, and that's the same is true with our side of the belt.
And that our fifth principle, I remember when we were developing this one, Rick had been writing kind of a research ethics document for Deohahage Indigenous Knowledge Center. And so we were thinking about let's just say the delicate matter of the kind of knowledge that should stay within its primary relationships and the people it's for, and then the principle of sharing what we know. The thing about knowledge is that in the knowledge that we have of the earth and so on, we need to share that kind of knowledge if we are going to be able to work together to protect the future of the environment and the many beings who live on it. And we need to understand what, like, Haudenosaunee tradition and Anishinaabe tradition know about those things, as well as what contemporary scientists are finding out about ecosystems and those kinds of things. So we need to share this knowledge. But then also there are particular societies of knowers, medicine societies and things, who have knowledge that's to be shared within their communities. So this sense of sharing and not owning knowledge, and yet how to keep it safe in the communities within which it should circulate.
Yeah, this becomes a big dilemma in the academy because researchers, students, both Indigenous and not, are beginning to copyright their dissertation. And it raises all kinds of questions about, just because I talk to you, now you don't own what I say, but if we share it, then it's not about that. So we're trying to move past this idea of cultural, intellectual property rights to looking at the responsibilities of that. So when I was young, and old men were trying to help me because, I didn't grow up with all of this knowledge. One day, one guy said, well, Rick, you can't know it all. Pick something that you want to focus in on and, just work on that. There'll be other people doing things and talk to them. And then one guy said, there are no experts in Haudenosaunee culture. Even though I looked at him as an expert and he knew so much, he could speak 5 languages, did all the ceremonies. He said, but when we come together, it's like we gather around a table and we put our ideas on the table. I said, Daniel, here's what I'm thinking. Daniel puts his ideas on it. Everybody around the circle put their ideas on there, and we think about that. We're trading ideas, we're influencing each other, and we all walk away a little enriched. Now, you may pick up an idea that may take you a while to really assimilate into your thinking. So, okay, now I understand what they were saying. That's the kind of exchange that we're talking about here. When you build a relationship, it is then a perpetual relationship. It's ongoing. So we chose this circle wampum to represent this because when they put up our original leaders, there were 50 of them. They stood in a circle. They were given their instructions. You could say they're given their mandate. But each one was an individual, had a different name, a different responsibility. So when it comes time to make decisions, they all contribute their knowledge, their understanding, their experience. And so the decision becomes the collective knowledge of that group that gets passed on to the next set of chiefs, the next one. Nobody will say, well, it was generation 10 that owned that knowledge, and therefore you got to get their approval. So if knowledge is cumulative in our own lives, the things that I've learned, it's also teaching you to remain a little bit humble, not to become arrogant. So, well, now I know it all. Now I reach this level of understanding, and therefore you have to come to me. But when you grow up thinking that this knowledge is important for you to live your life well, yes, you want to share that with everybody else. So you could say this is one of the distinctive differences of what we're proposing. How that works out in the academy, all of these principles still need a little bit of workshopping and ideas. But when you start sharing knowledge, it's for the mutual benefit of each other. So it's not just about getting your book or getting your PhD. It's about contributing really to the overall wellness of humanity. And so you could say that was the original intent of the True Row. It was the original intent of the covenant chain. And so we're not bringing up anything that's brand new or startling. We're just saying, this is what our ancestors had in mind for us. We're just now looking at it at a different lens. How could that apply to the academy? How could it apply to research? How could it apply to ecological projects, as we're discussing here? So that ethical space is really about your integrity, to be honest, to realize that you're just part of the whole network that's taking place there. And I think that's what then the Indigenous community is more likely to share when they trust you. And you become trusted not by saying, I'm the expert, I know everything, and I'm going to take this and commercialize it and produce a little happiness pill. We're going to say, no, there's something else going on here about building strength for the future.
And so there's these statements that we were thinking might be useful for some concluding meditations from Henry Lickers. It's not just where the nuts and berries are, it's the whole system of knowledge. You can get taken up with the details of where's the location, how many species, what are the data. But the whole earth is a system of knowledge. Like there's the set of relationships of an ecosystem or a biome are complex and rich and interconnected and interdependent, which is very true of our research techniques and methods too. They're interdependent and they have to be built for that long-term relationship. They talk about the when they were forming the two-row agreement, they were saying this is the purpose of making this relationship and building these intentions with one another is for the faces in the ground that are waiting to be born, for generations from now. And that whole holistic and whole system of knowing that grows out of the earth and the place where we are.
And Henry Lickers, Seneca worked for many years up at Akwesasne in the Mohawk territory in ecological issues. So his reflection, it was interesting to me. So all my experience have led me to this truth, that science and traditional knowledge need each other to be the whole knowledge system. So yes, you got to look at the larger picture beyond the location of the nut trees and the berry bushes. What's the system at work here? And what he's saying, both as a scientist and as a Mohawk, as a Seneca, that by bringing these ideas together, we will then see the larger picture, how things work from a scientific lens, how things work from an Indigenous lens, but it's then engaging in those two kinds of things. So it's not just having the Native people show up and conduct an opening ceremony and then you go on to your regular business, but it's rethinking what is the nature of research, what's the nature of our relationships, what's the nature of knowledge. And in doing that, I think we'll arrive at a whole new way in which we can together become stronger to face all of those ecological matters that we're looking at.
So it is in lots of ways about relationship. I think this is the logo for Deohahage Indigenous Knowledge Center that Rick designed. And you can see the two roads, the two paths there, and the linked arms of the people who are sharing the path of life on the river. And that's where we are. We all are sharing that ecological river of life, and we need to band together to share what we know with one another, not just for ourselves and our own communities, but for the river itself, to have sustenance and capability to make life, generations and generations into the future.
One of my mentors, Oren Lyons, an Onondaga, he said, it doesn't matter whether you're in the ship or the canoe, we're all being affected by the current ecological situation. And climate change is bringing about structural changes in our world. So we better get our thinking caps on. We better work a little harder. So that's why we put the vessel across these two paths, because it's really, as Oren said, we're on the same path. So we're affected by that. And so in the beginning, we said we're going to be brothers, and maybe that we're like the elder brother. We're going to bring some specialized knowledge about this place to our younger brother, who's going to learn and become that. And our younger brother grew up and then started to dominate the thinking about life. So what we're trying to do is bring balance back to that. So whether it's brotherhood or sisterhood, these two figures, we see that red dot in their heart. See, that's your knowledge is in your head and your heart, but that eagle feather then represents that combined knowledge, that gift of knowledge that comes from place, comes from understanding about that. So we're hoping that you'll be able to find some thing to resonate with you in the essay that we wrote, to encourage you to keep looking at what can ethical space, what can two-eyed seeing bring to these matters. But let's not forget that our ancestors were thinking about this 400 years ago and have provided to us a great intellectual, cultural, and personal path to follow. So our essay concludes with a discussion of the covenant chain, that friendship thing, the thing that links these two cultures, worldviews together. And they made a commitment to each other. From time to time, we're going to gather and repolish that chain, to renew it, to remove the dust that could interfere in productive relationships. Well, our governments might not be able to do this, but certainly between the academy and indigenous communities, polishing the chain will have a real significance. Yeah, there's a lot of troubles, a lot of issues that we have to deal with. We've got to work our way through that. But if we don't commit to polishing the chain to make the relationship strong, it's going to fall apart. So this chain has lasted all of this time, when you think about it, since the 1600s. But it needs our help now to turn it into a real relationship building. So we're here to help polish the chain. We encourage you to do that with the work that you do. And we thank you for this opportunity to share ideas with you.